Welcome everyone back to the Geneva Health Forum and, of course, our very last discussion for the day. And it boils down to just one simple question. Is COVID-19 the end of global health? Now, I'm sure that many of you watching might have your own thoughts about that, so please remember to submit your questions simply by entering your question in the chat box, and we'll leave some time to get through to just a few of those at the very end. Leading through our discussion today is Priti Patnaik, who's the editor of the Geneva Health Files. Welcome. I'll let you take the floor now.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Olivia. In this session of Geneva Health Forum, we welcome you to an exploration on whether multilateralism has succeeded or failed during COVID-19. I'm Priti Patnaik, the founding editor of Geneva Health Files, a reporting initiative that tracks the governance of global health. The question we are trying to answer today is united in crisis? Is COVID-19 the end of global health? We have two panelists joining us this evening to discuss this question. We have Mr. Robert Mardini, Director General, International Committee of the Red Cross. He's responsible for leading global humanitarian operations for 20,000 staff in more than 90 countries. And prior to this, he was the permanent observer and head of delegation of the ICRC to the UN in New York, where he steered ICRC's diplomatic engagement with the Security Council, the General Assembly, and member states on humanitarian issues. Our second guest is Mr. Thomas Cooney, Director General, International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Association, the IFPMA, essentially the Global Association of Pharma Research Companies. He also represents the industry on the ACT Accelerator, the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator established at WHO by multiple stakeholders to fast-track the response to the pandemic. Thank you for joining us today, gentlemen. We will begin by brief introductory remarks. And we have some questions for you, and we head over for some audience questions later during the event, and have some closing remarks for you from you on the future of multilateralism. So let's get going. Our panelists will tell us if they think COVID-19 is the end of global health, or has there indeed been international cooperation. We first go over to Mr. Mardini. Perhaps you can speak in the context of what multilateralism has meant for the humanitarian sector during COVID-19.
Thank you very much, and great to be here. I think even for an ICRC representative, it's safe to say that multilateralism maybe did not deliver so far impressive results in connection with the COVID-19 pandemic, but it has garnered the minimum level of support for the humanitarian system to be able to respond. And I think we should not underestimate this. Of course, I think the new acid test for multilateralism is when we have an effective vaccine. It seems that we are not very far from this point, but we will see how this develops. Otherwise, and unfortunately, nothing new really. Multilateralism has been under strain for years now. Arguably, the pandemic highlighted the need for government and for coordinated and collective action. And yet, the unfolding economic crisis will continue to generate a strong pull to unilateralism and protectionism. I think so far, COVID-19 is spotlighting existing fragilities and gaps in the system. So definitely, the system needs to be adapted.
Thank you so much. Mr. Cooney, do you think that COVID-19 is the end of global health, as this session is called, or are you hopeful for the future of multilateralism in health?
The short answer is no. COVID-19 is not the end of global health, quite the opposite. I think it really has reminded us about the importance of global health, because I know 8 months ago when I had a discussion with our communication director, I compared COVID-19 to Spanish flu and Grand Depression coming together, 1918 and 1929. And at that time, she said, "You must be joking. Can't be that bad." Actually, when you look at the economic impact and when you look at the health impact, I think never before, never since 1918-19 has the world been confronted to such a challenge. Now, in terms of multilateralism, and we will talk about this, let's not deceive ourselves. Multilateralism is in a bit of a crisis. It's not just WHO, it's also WTO. When you look at the inability, for example, of the litigation system in WTO, it's many other organizations. Now, some of that really has been seen with the response to COVID-19. We need multilateralism. We need partnership. And when I look at my experience over the last few months in the ACT-A partnership, I've never seen as much everybody pulling in the same direction, everybody deeply conscious that you need academia, international organization, governments, regulatory agencies, and philanthropy with the private sector to work on it. Therefore, I think we have seen the need, the urgency, and we also are deeply conscious until no one is left behind, this crisis will not be over. But having said that, there are many challenges, and we should also be open to address some of the flaws the system showed at the beginning of this crisis. For example, weaknesses in the international health regulations when it comes to when do you call a pandemic, questions about travel restrictions, yes or no, questions about sharing of pathogen organisms, and many others. But overall, never before we had as much partnership, solidarity as now, even though I'm the first one to admit it's far from perfect.
Thank you for those remarks. We will come back to the ACT Accelerator, but essentially I think both of you are converging that it is an imperfect system, and in fact Mr. Mardini said that multilateralism is in a little bit of a crisis. We will delve into this a little more. Mr. Mardini, my question to you is, do you think that every country today has a seat at the table as far as decision-making on the pandemic is concerned? What do you think about this whole paradigm of a lot of high-income and middle-income countries donating doses to low- and middle-income to countries? Is that really multilateralism?
Well, I think the effective response is beyond just the vaccine issue, because so far there is no vaccine available. And the fact of the matter is, and I'm just back from a 4-day visit to Afghanistan, where decades of conflicts, continued insecurity, severe drought, and COVID-19 outbreak have had a devastating impact on people. So in terms of impact on the people we serve, it is critical to look at everything that we can put in place today to make the situation better. And this connects with the water and sanitation response, all the measures to support hospitals, health centers, which are getting patients from COVID, but also from other challenges, global health challenges playing out in many of the countries. So of course, the vaccine will be an important step. The access to vaccine and to bringing the vaccine where people need it most will be the most critical challenge for the multilateral system, because you need to overcome tensions, you need to overcome polarization, you need to overcome conflict, and sometimes negotiating with parties to the conflict, crossing front lines, and being able to deliver the vaccine where it is needed most. So today it's hard to say that each and every country has an equal voice at the table, but there is a case to be made to have as much as possible countries deciding about how to prioritize the most the best possible response to the COVID in their countries, because the realities are different from one country to the other.
Right, you are absolutely right in underlining the fact that there has been an overwhelming emphasis on vaccines, but actually COVID-19 has exposed a whole host of issues, including the tricky issues of water and sanitation, which are sort of central to addressing this pandemic. And I meant to say earlier that please feel free to disagree, agree, and interrupt each other. This is more like a conversation. So if there's something you would want to add to, please feel free and go ahead. My question to Mr. Cooney is really, you are a part of the ACT Accelerator, and depending on who you speak to, people will say that it's a great success or it is not. We actually have a slide coming up soon that shows COVAX, the number of confirmed orders of vaccine doses per person. You will see that COVAX is really, this is from The Economist, by the way, and COVAX is right down the pecking order, as it were. So some will say that COVAX is a shining example in international cooperation, but others believe it has serious limitations. What's your take on this? We would really like to know if you think that this slide captures actually the failure of multilateralism in some sense.
But let's maybe, before we get into the exact vaccine allocations and where we are, go a little bit more into the multilateralism question. I think, and there Robert Martin already alluded to it, multilateralism is in a bit of a crisis. And one of the reasons, and we saw it throughout the year, is that the one nation which created the architecture of the post-World War II multilateral system, whether it's the UN, whether it's many of the international organizations, including IMF and the World Bank, this one organization, country has this year, by and large, abstained from multilateralism. I don't think that we saw much action from G7. What we did say is the announcement of the US leaving WHO. Now, if we wouldn't have WHO, in my view, we would need to create WHO because we need a World Health Organization, and we need a World Health Organization which must be strengthened, but also must be willing to look into what went right and what went wrong. And there I do hope, whether it happens sooner or later, I'm optimistic that at the end of the day, there are some major forces which make people see that we need to come together. One of the challenges early on in COVID-19 was January 10, when the genomic sequence of SARS-CoV-2 were put on a, by the way, open innovation database, GSAID, which is basically a consortium of scientists from around the world working together. Maybe this could have happened 4-6 weeks earlier. And one needs to look into what are the origins of it and why wasn't WHO allowed to really, dig deeper and find out where the pandemic started. One needs to look into, for example, Tedros early on was criticizing every single country which imposed travel bans. When I look back at it, maybe one waited for too long to have travel restrictions. When I also look at how South Asia, how Asia is coping, the countries doing best with, in the pandemic are countries like Korea, like Chinese Taipei, like Japan, Singapore, who, because probably of their exposure to SARS in 2003, were much better equipped than we Europeans. When I look at, for example, the COVAX situation 7-8 months ago, some people said COVID will be an absolute disaster for Africa. Now, when I look at how the African CDC and many countries in Africa cope, they are much, much better off in this pandemic than, for example, Europe is, including, I'm sitting now in Basel in home office. My region has about 1/5 of the infection rates per population Geneva has. Europe, including Switzerland, France, Spain, Italy, have really seen their health systems stretched enormously, where some countries have done much better. I think we really need to have a proper thorough look into what went right, what went wrong. In terms of the Act A, I think it's premature to say it's a failure, it's a success. I can tell you within the Act A, I think the one which is working probably best, everybody pulling on the same string, is the COVAX facility. One of the reasons being that before SARS-CoV-2, CEPI was created in 2017. Countries, European Commission, but also countries said that we want to give money to CEPI so that they can build up a portfolio of several vaccines. CEPI didn't have that much money, but they did have some money. The COVAX facility now has a portfolio of about 10 vaccine candidates. We also were fortunate to have Gavi, which was created in 2000, with a tremendous performance in terms of getting the vaccines to the people, the children who need them in the 73 Gavi countries. Therefore, we didn't start from scratch. Now, the challenge, what you showed, is that notwithstanding all the declamatory statements for solidarity, no one left behind, and I saw this last week at the Paris Peace Conference, you had Chancellor Merkel firmly committed to the solidarity of COVAX, but the day before, her health minister, who is also a very strong politician, said it's inconceivable that German vaccines manufactured in Germany will leave the country before the Germans have them. That doesn't sound that much different from what I heard from President Trump in the US. And by the way, when you look at Narendra Modi or President Putin in Russia, let's say the Americans were not the only ones in terms of vaccine nationalism, and therefore we are confronted with the world. The ICRC is probably better equipped than all of us. They are used to dealing with unstable conditions, with fragile societies. But we also have to come to grips. We will not have the ideal situation where one organization, be it WHO or the COVAX facility, will decide we will allocate the vaccines based on need rather than on the basis of who pays how much.
Right. So just coming back to what Mr. Mardini flagged before on countries having a greater role on deciding on equitable access to COVID-19 medical products, but clearly, this is not happening. How would you respond to that? You mentioned going back to the early months of the pandemic, and we have a commission, independent panel supposedly underway. Looking at the questions on the origins of the virus and so on, and be that as it may, some would believe that the protectionism and the vaccine nationalism that we are witnessing, some of it could be also contributed because of bilateral deals the industry has struck. How would you see the role of the industry in the context of multilateralism and actually contributing to the state of affairs in some ways? Mr. Cooney.
No, in principle, actually, the industry has done everything you hoped the industry would do in such a crisis, because from February, scientists in companies were really working 24/7 to look at repurposing treatments, look at compound libraries, try to develop vaccines, and do so at unprecedented speed. Now, one of the reasons why, of course, we are where we are, actually much faster than we are, and we should have, I think we should not have much debate about it. If it hadn't been for BARDA, the US agency, which does have a huge budget to risk share, invest in clinical trials, co-invest in scaling up manufacturing capacities, we wouldn't even be talking about the vaccine being approved maybe before the end of the year and having large quantities available next year. Now, the challenge is that at the beginning, the COVAX facility, Gavi, CEPI, they didn't have the checks, the money. Therefore, companies did sign up some bilateral deals, but when you look at it, companies made it very clear from the beginning that they want to be part of COVAX. You had AstraZeneca indicating that they put aside 300 million doses for the COVAX facility. We have had during the UN General Assembly the CEO and chairman of J&J saying we want 500 million doses from J&J, which goes into developing countries. You have from Australia, CSL and Queensland University, which said 50% of every dose manufactured will immediately go into the COVAX and 50% will be used for Australia. Therefore, we have had Sanofi, Pasteur and GSK sign a joint statement of intent. Now, one of the challenges will be and is you do have deals because governments, including the European Union, they put up money at the time when the COVAX facility didn't know yet whether they have money. Having said that, I'm really cautiously optimistic that we will not have a repeat of H1N1 because H1N1, the swine flu in 2009, literally all the vaccines and antivirals were bought up by the rich countries, including Switzerland, and nothing at all was reserved for developing countries. Here we do have, I think, a realistic objective of 2 billion doses going into the COVAX next year. And when you look at the overall bilateral deals, by the way, the highest volumes right now are reserved for developing countries because most of these comparisons which you get, including in The Economist and otherwise, they do not look at the aggregate sum which is reserved for developing countries. And there, when you look at India, when you look at also China, and when you look at other developing countries, Brazil, Mexico, others, the biggest number of, even before the US, is for the aggregate of developing countries. But it's not the ideal situation. We were hoping at the beginning COVAX facility might really be the one doing the allocations.
No, absolutely. But we are not only talking about the middle-income countries and the middle powers, as it were. Coming back to Mr. Mardini, apart from the high-level discussions in Geneva and policymakers, deciding on the allocation framework and so on, give us a perspective on how this looks, from ground up in the humanitarian settings of the world. What does all this even mean? 2 billion doses by 2021, clearly not enough, and we will be missing out on the most vulnerable people in the world. How does it look from ground up? What have you heard? What, in your experience, will get countries to work together on this?
Well, I think let me just bring one important perspective that is the reality on the ground in situation of armed conflict. So conflict zones are really at the sharp end of a pandemic, and there really the pandemic exacerbates existing vulnerabilities of people, marginalization and inequalities. And the vaccine will only mark the beginning of a slow climb out of the pandemic rather than a decisive end to it. Let's be frank, with the International Federation of Red Crescent Societies and the UN Secretary General, we have clearly called for a people vaccine, one that is safe, effective, affordable, and equitably accessible. But there is a real risk that other pressing issues such as conflict prevention and resolution, climate change, poverty reduction, and other health challenges are being ignored. Let us not forget that due to the pandemic, immunization campaigns have been delayed or cancelled. People have been unable to access other health services. We have huge problems of sexual and reproductive health in contexts where we are present. Health staff and humanitarian actors, frontliners are exhausted, which is impacting the capacity and resilience of essential services. There are three ways in which I think as a humanitarian sector we have been impacted, and we will likely continue to be impacted. The first one is our operating model. We cannot move staff and goods as freely and ensure the same level of proximity to the people we serve. We need to adapt the way we deliver humanitarian aid, the way we work, the safe use of digital tools, for instance. Since March, we have done more in the field of telemedicines. We have been innovative in asking religious leaders to disseminate public health messages through radio waves. But at the same time, we had to negotiate special agreements with the states to waive COVID-related restrictions in more than 80 different countries. Because in our business, physical proximity will remain key for an organization that needs to build trust, to negotiate access, to cross front lines, and to help people in need. The other one is our people. We had also faced a great deal of duty of care challenge for our colleagues on the ground with the mental health challenges, which of course open up a new area of challenges any humanitarian organization needs to address. And of course, the third one is our funding. We have restricted funding from our donors who are, and this is legitimate, focusing on their domestic response. So the resources available for humanitarian funding are dwindling. So this is and to this, of course, you add the socioeconomic crisis that is also hitting hard most of the countries. By the end of the year, more people will be dying in the context the ICRC is present in from maybe hunger than from COVID-19. And as such, humanitarian interventions that are multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary, and that address several determinants of health are definitely required.
Can you hear us? I think we lost you there in between.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Did you want to complete your intervention?
It's echoing, but
Is this better now?
yeah, slightly better.
All right. Just to
I think we need to continue moving towards a humanitarian approach that not only addresses the immediate issues at hand, which is the life-saving today, but that is also factoring in longer-term perspective. The pandemic has put a spotlight on existing weaknesses and fragilities, many of them due to underperforming systems, including health, identifying, for instance, essential services and pieces of a system that could be strengthened amidst a crisis, which is absolutely key to ensure resilience of communities, of those systems and the communities that depend on them. We have learned in this pandemic that we need to invest more on building local capacity, as it will allow us to reach sustainable outcomes and respond to the next health crisis. The COVID-19 pandemic has really highlighted the transition into an era of vulnerability at global scale, and has compounded pre-existing calls to rethink the global aid architecture, intensified by the plateauing and possible contraction of traditional humanitarian funding. So there is a need for... Sorry?
If I just have an additional question for you, whether do you think there is any momentum right now for a reform of humanitarianism as a consequence of COVID-19? I think we are beginning to get a sense that multilateralism has not sufficiently addressed COVID-19, and we have also other challenges piling up. So how do you see this going forward? The other challenges of that the humanitarian sector faced prior to COVID-19 as well?
Well, I think the humanitarian sector has been reinventing itself and certainly needs to have a critical look on the way we do business, and there are changes underway today. It is clear that one of the big learnings of the COVID-19 pandemic is we need to invest in local action, in local actors, in local players. The role of for instance, National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, volunteers on the ground, the largest humanitarian network on the planet, has been, by and large, the first responders. And I think the humanitarian sector needs to be more brave in investing in a more sustainable way in local capacities, in a sustainable way, rather than spreading resources here and there. And we've seen that in places where national society development, capacity building was done well, these are the places where our colleagues were able to have a more meaningful response to COVID, but also to the other challenges communities are facing, such as armed conflict, climate change, and so forth.
Right. I just want to bring back to the funding issues for the humanitarian sector in the context of global health. We understand that there's not much of a diversity in funding, and that's kind of also makes it difficult and inflexible for actors such as the World Health Organization, for instance, while responding to emergencies. How do you think that has an impact, the fact that there are very apparently just 15 major funders funding health emergencies?
Well, it is clear that also, I mean, the business model of the humanitarian sector needs to be rethought. And of course, there needs to be a diversification of sources of funding from public sources, but also from private sources, from the private sector. We need to explore better innovative financing, impact investing, and crowd in private funds in the humanitarian sector. This, of course, is labor intensive. It's more difficult, but this is definitely the way forward, because and this is where also multilateralism is important, actually. I mean, if we take a step back from COVID and we remember the Geneva Conventions, they are a proof that multilateralism can work. They were negotiated 71 years ago by states, all states, in 3 months, and they were able to agree on them. Maybe today it would be more difficult to do this, but they are also essential for multilateralism to work, because if you take the context of armed conflict, it's not just about stepping up the humanitarian response. It's also about shrinking the needs in the first place. And in armed conflict, shrinking the needs is about ensuring respect for international humanitarian law, the rules of war, protecting civilians during military operations. In the field of global health, it is about prevention and investing in water and sanitation, investing in primary health care is also overdue in the vast majority of countries today that are in a critical situation. So it's not just about increasing the funding for the short-term emergency response. It's about also longer-term investment, and it's about also development. So this is where emergency and development intertwine, and where states and organizations need to work hand in hand, create new alliances to have meaningful response in the long term. I mean, even in armed conflict, ironically, if you take the 10 top operations where the ICRC is present, we've been present for, on average, 3 to 4 decades, which means that even violent conflicts are not solved in a short time, and where we need to rethink the way we can support communities impacted.
Right. All right. Thanks a lot. Continuing with this, I mean, really appreciate your perspective on, what it means on the ground. Something we forget in places like Geneva. Continuing with this, theme of diversity of funding, Mr. Cooney, you mentioned the Paris Peace Forum, which is interesting because we do see this moment now in global health where structures like the ACT accelerator are seen to be somehow the answer for the future as to this is the way we should have this kind of multi-stakeholder approach. And a lot of people are, of course, critical of it because one can argue that it's not strictly multilateral in that sense because we have pronounced role of the private sector and the foundations and other actors and select group of countries and so on. How would you see this going forward, notwithstanding the geopolitics at WHO, but overall the funding for some of the most acute global health challenges going forward? What is the significance for you of the Paris Peace Forum in some sense?
I think in terms of responding to the pandemic challenge we are confronted now and probably will be confronted for more or less the whole of next year, but also preparing for future pandemics, we really need to draw from what worked well and what didn't work. And down to earth, I think one of the lessons which you see now is it is not scientists from WHO coming up with the vaccines, neither the research development nor the manufacturing. I had a conversation with one of the leaders of one of these international organizations just on Saturday. And he said, at the end of the day, there are 5 or 6 multinational corporations with the capacity, the know-how, the experience to manufacture high-quality vaccines at hundreds of millions of doses. 5 or 6 big multinational corporations. What we see now is the strength of, for example, and the willingness of these big companies to team up with a small German biotech company like BioNTech, or team up with Oxford University, or CSL with Queensland University. You have collaborations as we never had before. And all of us understand we do need to work hand in hand with the CEPIs, the GAVs, the WHO. In the context, for example, of will those who need it most get it, the humanitarian approach, I think one of the encouraging signals in the COVAX facility is there's a consensus that there needs to be a buffer, a humanitarian buffer, which WHO can allocate to those in most need. And I'm not sure that the people who need it most will be the ones who have to wait longest, because there's an agreement that the vaccine allocation really needs to look after frontline healthcare workers, wherever they are, needs to look after vulnerable populations like the elderly, wherever they are. It also, when you look at medical need right now, monoclonal antibodies in terms of treatments probably offer the best hope to keep people out of hospital. Now, where's the most need? Where's the virus most virulent right now? In the United States. Now, we could probably spend hours. Why is it that the CDC in Africa and African countries sort of were more successful in terms of social distancing, hand hygiene, mask wearing than people in the richest country of the world are? But I believe that we really see the importance of the private sector being involved and being included. What you also see is the private sector, and I could give you a number of examples on that, is fully sensitive. It's not just that people expect the treatments or vaccines or tests from us. They also expect them available, accessible, and affordable. That requires that there needs to be a differential pricing. I must say I'm great admirer of ICRC and the innovative approaches to innovative financing, like impact funding, or, for example, when you look at diabetes, you wouldn't have been able in the ICRC to strike a big contract with Novo Nordisk unless Novo Nordisk would have agreed to sell it to you at, let's say, way below commercial rates. I don't think that they will make a profit, but in terms of making sure that the insulin gets to the people who need them most, I think it was courageous from Peter Maurer, who dared to sit down with the private sector, but it was equally good for a Novo Nordisk to sit down with the ICRC. And we see this kind of collaboration right now with Eli Lilly teaming up with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for the Fuji facility, the bioreactor in Denmark, which is solely devoted to developing countries. We see it with the collaboration between AstraZeneca and the Serum Institute of India, and we see multiple such collaborations, but without the private sector really respected and at the table and acknowledge that we need to work together. Private sector needs to understand this is not business as usual. This is business not as usual. This is not the time to make zillions. It is the time to show the importance of our sector to bring us out of the pandemic.
I think all of the role that the private sector has been playing, we don't dispute that. But in some sense, there's a perception that it's still tinkering at the margins of what is really possible and what is actually really needed. It's very tempting for me to ask your opinion, Mr. Cooney, on this new proposal brewing at the WTO. You mentioned WTO in your opening remarks. Some would say that it is that defining moment in multilateralism where countries can potentially come together and push through the TRIPS waiver proposal. What are your opinions on that?
My opinion is it's not really solution-oriented. I must be very honest, without a strong, innovative private sector, which is based on strong research, competitive research, the research protected by IP, as an enabler of innovation, we wouldn't be here where we are now. You have 200 plus vaccine candidates, you have multiple treatments. Therefore, at this time when the private sector does exactly what you would hope for, signing voluntary licenses with multiple Indian generic companies, for example, for remdesivir, sharing capacity to scale up the manufacturing, willing to take risk and scale up. I've had quite a number of companies who reached out to me. Can you get us in touch with WHO on pre-qualification? Can you get us in touch with, for example, the Global Fund or UNICEF? Because we are working on what we think promising product. And we are keen to make sure that these products reach the patients in developing countries. Now, quite often, nothing came out of it. Quite often, actually, the companies had invested money, time and energy. Nothing came out of it, but it can't be accused for want of trying. But to come at this time when the companies are doing everything you hope for and say, but you have to give away your patents, and the patents is really the enabler of the fast response to COVID-19, there, I'm awfully sorry. I'm not going to say, let's just take this. It's at the end of the day, it's politics. And politics in WTO has not really brought us closer to a solution for the pandemic.
Well, I think WTO is a key forum where this will play out. You mentioned voluntary licensing, but the industry also has not shown a lot of interest in the COVID-19 technology access pool, for example, which is a much more milder version of the TRIPS waiver proposal.
No, but the CTAP at the same time, because companies Gilead has signed licenses for 127 countries for remdesivir. Now, WHO in the meantime has come out and said it doesn't help anything. When I talk to clinicians, I must say, if I were attacked by COVID-19, and God forbid that I am, I would be glad if I would have access to remdesivir. Gilead did invest at risk. They did sign a lot of voluntary licenses for 127 countries at the time when some people hoped that chloroquine or hydroxychloroquine might have an impact. In the meantime, we know it doesn't. You had many companies really looking at how can we scale up, how can we do it? But at the same time, they also accepted you need to do randomized clinical trials, controlled clinical trials. We have had, for example, anti-inflammatories. One of the Swiss company had a very promising compound based on anecdotal evidence. Unfortunately, for the time being, the results were disappointing, which means their investments were null and void. They still try to find out, maybe given at the right time, maybe given in combination. Therefore, companies are really doing, I mentioned Lilly, for example, their agreement with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation solely for developing countries is tech transfer royalty free. What else can you hope for? And I had discussions with the mission from Costa Rica early on, and I said, if you want to do something, then one should promote the use, for example, of the medicines patent pool. But then, with all due respect, if the medicines patent pool then comes and say, yeah, but we want a license for the world, and not just for those who need it most, maybe those who need it most, they need to wait till the companies work out something where they can really make sure that the medicines, the treatments or vaccines reach those. And that's where the Gavi model has worked very well, because Gavi model ensures access at very low prices, or even more or less, for free in the countries most in need. Middle-income countries pay normally more, and the rich countries are not Gavi countries, but they are able to self-fund.
Well, I think just for the record, even with Gilead's deal, it does, on remdesivir, for instance, it does exclude a big part of the world. Just taking a step back from these very specific discussions, Mr. Mardini, coming back to you on essentially the future of multilateralism in very specific terms over the next 1 or 2 years. How do you think this is going to pan out? What we understand as, who wields power in making these decisions? What will it mean for the humanitarian sector? If we have a number of other kinds of stakeholders being involved in the decision-making process, what will be the impact and consequence on the humanitarian sector as a result of these kinds of changes in decision-making?
Well, I've seen multilateralism under huge pressure in New York and recently in the Security Council over the major conflicts, and of course it is a source of concern to see that it is very hard to have political convergence, leadership over what needs to be a low-hanging fruit and solving some of the conflicts. But at the same time, there is a case to be made that the fact that multilateralism was under pressure has also contributed to reinforce it in a way. But definitely, I think that the system needs to be adapted going forward, because state-based organization or exclusively state-based bilateral cooperation alone is not enough today to address the incredibly complex transnational challenges we face, from climate change to conflict lasting 4 decades and more, growing inequality, let alone pandemics. Because also the extent and the types of needs we observe in conflict zones require responses that go really beyond what the humanitarian sector can deliver. And I think today everyone would agree that no group's response will be sufficient on its own. So how should it be adapted? I think we need today new alliances, we need new thinking, a new action to address these crises and keep people really at the center of any decisions. For this, the multilateral system ought to value spaces for multiple stakeholders to come together and complement traditional state-based processes. We need complementarity with local institutions. This is absolutely critical, and non-government actors, including Red Cross, Red Crescent, national societies, with the UN agencies and system, with development actors, the private sector and others, especially local communities. And I think beyond looking to fixing a system and lamenting the end of rules-based international order, let's look at the strategies that are working, and there are some that are working. Let's bring the front lines of conflict into the equation. This is where sometimes and often, ironically, consensus can be found. Look at Nagorno-Karabakh, where my colleagues are trying to today exchange human remains and dead bodies. Look at Yemen, where we were able to facilitate the exchange of detainees, even at a time where the conflict is still very much active. So around the notion of preserving humanity, things can be done, and let's remain optimistic and let's understand what works and figure out how to replicate this in other fields, including how to respond to a pandemic where we are all learning by the day.
Thanks a lot for those remarks. I had one question for Mr. Koini. As a Swiss citizen, how do you see this moment in multilateralism from the point of view of Switzerland? It seems that it is definitely, one of those special moments in history, and Switzerland, as an aside, also joined pretty late the COVAX facility, but they have made pretty strong statements about multilateralism, about preserving this nature.
I think I'm a former Swiss diplomat, and actually I did my short diplomatic career all in multilateralism. I believe in the strength and the force and the good of multilateralism. When I look at now COVID-19, I also believe that most Swiss don't fully recognize and acknowledge to what extent Geneva is really the world health capital. The CEPI is not based in Geneva, but pretty much everything else, WHO, Global Fund, Gavi, Unitate, you have so many organizations. And when I look at Robert Mardini, I think about 40% of your budget in the ICRC is now spent on health. And actually, it's no longer stitching together the wounded in the battlefield, but it's really looking after the most vulnerable, the women, the pregnant, the elderly, including with NCD. And I have great respect for what you do there. In that respect, I think we really should have Switzerland make an even stronger drive than it already does. I like the digital initiative, which I see. At the same time, when I look at, let's say, Act A, when I look at the Facilitation Council, even when I look at bilateral versus multilateral deals, I would have wished a little bit more presence and leadership from Switzerland in this, really I think, historic moment in Geneva. Some of my friends tell me it's done very discreetly. It's nice. But even if it were discreetly, I think I should see more of it. Therefore, I would wish a more active role of Switzerland. And I can give you one example. Until recently, this year's global, vaccine summit, which Gavi organized for their replenishment, I was so embarrassed. Switzerland's contribution to Gavi was about 1/5 of the International Lions Club. With all due respect to the International Lions Club, but the Swiss contribution was single-digit number. Now it's a little bit more, but it still dwarfs compared to, for example, Norway, Netherlands, Sweden, countries which also have strong tradition. Now, I do know that Switzerland rightly gives a lot of priority to the ICRC, and by no way I would want Switzerland to give less money to the ICRC, but I would wish Switzerland investing a bit more in the multilateral health institutions than they did. And as I said, spending so much less than the International Lions Club, that's embarrassing.
Right. We have one question from the audience that sort of sums up this session in a way, and it could also be your final remarks on this subject. The question is, do you think anything will change in health multilateralism after this crisis is over? Or will we just turn back to the troublesome WHO, WTO that we have been in some time now? This is a question from the audience. You're free to comment on this. Mr. Mardini.
Well, I'm an optimistic person, and I really hope that yes, it will be a push for a better practice going forward. I mean, this pandemic has and is still having a huge impact on the planet, and I think there is a lot of changes happening. We should not underestimate the changes happening in the way we work, the way we do diplomacy, the way we also come together. And I think going forward, states will be in a position, in a unique position to cooperate, to find a solution for this. And I think I see it more of an opportunity than going forward for multilateralism.
Thank you. And Mr. Cooney, are you looking forward to a new global health order?
I must say, as Robert Mardini said, I was born an optimist, therefore I'm an optimist. I do already now see very encouraging signals of new form of public-private partnerships, of really one actor which hasn't even been mentioned yet is the international regulatory agencies. When you look how FDA, EMA, PMDA and WHO collaborate already now. Imagine how the situation would be for vaccines in developing countries if you wouldn't have WHO coordinating and harmonizing regulatory approval. So that is a realistic hope that maybe within days or maybe a week or two after you got emergency approval, maybe by the EMA or the FDA, you might get the same from WHO, which is the precondition for these vaccines to be used. Therefore, I'm an optimist. What I also see, and that's the important discussion, it's not just discussion on the current COVID-19, it is many people have started a debate future pandemic preparedness. How can we make sure that we are not as ill-equipped, badly caught out? You know, many countries, governments, the masks, including Switzerland, the protective equipment for the healthcare workers, you know, the shortages of oxygen and respirators. Many countries were really caught out, and you could see that the cost cutting in many healthcare systems with intensive care units has gone too far. My British colleagues, always proud of the NHS, didn't quite do as well as one would hope. Germany, on the other hand, did really well. Therefore, I do believe that we need to talk about future pandemic preparedness. And two examples, just to close off. I believe in the power of science. When you look at the messenger RNA technology for vaccine, has the potential to be applicable for future pandemics. We just need to make sure that we are ready then. The same with the monoclonal antibodies. Again, could have the same because they're agile, versatile, and can be rapidly scaled up. But we need to start discussing now, how will we be better prepared? And I'm confident I see a lot of willingness among the leaders from WHO, CEPI, Gavi, Global Fund, and others to really engage. And the World Bank, by the way, is also doing an exemplary job in helping on health system strengthening and even giving money for developing countries.
Right. Thanks so much. You're right. I think the emergence of World Bank on the global health scene in the context of this pandemic has been understated. I think our panelists have been optimistic that it is not going to be the end of COVID-19 is not going to be the end of global health. I'm not sure a lot of people are as optimistic, but let's hope that there are new sort of organic configurations, not just at the political level, but even outside, where different stakeholders can come together and address some of these issues. I think with this, we will conclude this session, and we are thankful to our panelists, Mr. Mardini and Mr. Koni, for joining us this evening and bringing some optimism into this dark winter, as it were. And also to the audience, thank you so much for joining us. And I hand over now to my colleague, Olivia, back to Geneva Health Forum. Thank you so much.
Thank you
A
very
big
much.
thank you, Priti,
Thank
also
you very
for
much.
joining us today, and also to our panelists for finishing on such an optimistic tone. That, of course, brings us to the very end of day one of the Geneva Health Forum. It's already been an eventful day, and we've heard from the likes of the World Organization, Novartis, and Merck. A big thanks to everyone who tuned in from all around the world, to our expert panelists for sharing their insights, and of course to our lovely moderators for guiding us throughout all these complex discussions. And of course, I hope that everyone also had a bit of time to enjoy a bit of yoga throughout the day. We look forward to seeing you first thing tomorrow at 9:30, where it's all about digital health. In the meantime, take care, stay safe, and we will see you very shortly. Good evening.